Computer. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. First, I want to remind the participants in the gallery about the format. I'm going to do a short intro to Professor Micheal Mohammed Knight, and then he will speak for 15 minutes. And then I will speak for 15 minutes. And during that time, if you have questions or comments, you can put them into the chat. If you would like to read out your own question later, just sort of indicate that you're okay with me turning over the video to you, because although I will post this for about a week on the Patreon page, so it will be exclusive. After that, I am going to post it as public, and so that means that anybody will be able to see it. So I respect anybody who feels they need some discretion with regard to participating in the conversation. But if you're okay to participate in the conversation with both your video and your audio, then raise your hand, after the presentation portion, or indicate in the chat that you would like to, ask your own question. And I just, I don't need to vet. It's not that kind of thing. But that's for your own discretion. Hopefully we'll be here about an hour. That means the first part is, just about a half an hour, with the exception of if there's any comments that Micheal wants to make after I make my comments. I hope there'll be a little bit of opportunity for us to chat with each other before opening to the gallery. And the introduction is, Micheal Mohammed Knight is the author of 12 books, including fiction, creative nonfiction, scholarship, and scholarly reflection. Most recently, Mohammed, 40 Introductions. And I have a very small library here, but I got my copy. His next book, Mohammed's Body, examines the ways that hadiths imagine and construct the prophetic body and its relationship to power. Wow, I'm looking forward to that. He is currently Assistant Professor of Religion and Cultural Studies at the University of Central Florida. So Professor Knight, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I start with gratitude for you inviting me here and having me here repeatedly through the years. And it's been, I don't know how many years it's been now, but there's just been this repeated generosity from your side that has not been earned on my side, but I'm thankful for it. I'm thankful for not only the work that you've done, but the way that you embody it as you carry it through the world. I've had a chance over the years to, watch your reception, and we use the phrase takfiri trolls sometimes, but the way that you embody what you put out there, I'm grateful for that, and also for the way that you give us a way of locating ourselves in a tradition, because we need our shuyukh too, right? We need a place to say, this is where we're coming from inside the tradition. So I start with gratitude. As part of my preparation for the conversation that we're going to have, I checked out your most recent khutbah, and that's one of the points on which your work has most resonated with me, because I've always struggled with the Abraham story, thinking about it as the Abraham story, right? Like centering him, prioritizing him in it, which was my initial experience of that story. And I came to that from the perspective of an Ismail baby. I thought of myself as an Ismail baby. And in terms of, the man putting a knife to baby's throat because the voice is into was something that was wounding for me personally. I was that baby, that was part of the experience behind my conversion initially, was trying to resolve that, in my life. uh, I came to Islam when I was 14, 15 was when I encountered Malcolm X. This was during the early 90s Malcolm X renaissance, right? So like X hats are everywhere. I bought the autobiography in a supermarket, like a $5 paperback. That's how widely disseminated Malcolm was in pop culture at that time, right? Like the first time I heard his name or his voice was on UMTV Raps. There was, I could go to the movie theater and watch a reenactment of his assassination. So that was everywhere. And, Malcolm obviously has so many meanings and so many different contexts. For me, as an Ismail baby, I looked to Malcolm as this kind of imaginary father figure. And there's a lot of what Malcolm might have termed benevolent patriarchy in his thought and in his work, in the content that he put out. And as a kid really wounded by patriarchal violence, I very ironically saw more patriarchy as the solution. And, I've seen other people take that road, and, it's bewildering to me now. But that was the route that I took as a young man trying to sort this out, that, oh, well, my mother wasn't controlled by the right man. If it was a better man or a better system of patriarchal governance around her, then she would have been protected and I would have been protected. So I very much latched on to the kind of masculinity, this very instructive masculinity that I found in Malcolm X at the time. I tried to heal those wounds in part through a conversion to Islam. And along with that, quote unquote benevolent patriarchy model that I was adopting also came a very, very strictly, very tightly defined representation of what Islam was. And I don't want to take too much time, but I can elaborate more on this. That bubble pops, like it does for so many converts. That bubble pops, and I've spent most of the last 20 plus years trying to reassemble something that disintegrated for me. Today, I've ventured out of that Salafi territory that I was in at first. I have scattered pieces, from all over the place, and I engage Sufism. I actually pledged a Sufi order. I take part in shrine culture when I have that opportunity. The 5%ers were enormously significant for me in multiple ways that I can talk about. I still have a complex relationship to brick and mortar masjids. Back when that was a thing that existed, in the old world. I would have a complex relationship to those communities. I've taken part in ayahuasca, which is an opening to conversations about the divine feminine. I recall in your khutbah you referencing the divine feminine, and part of our conversation before having this happen was that was one of the kind of the pulls. It was like, okay, we can talk about the divine feminine because that's a portal that I've seen open, and I'm waiting to have more of that. And of course your work and the space that you create, where it's all led to me, because I haven't put it all together. I have all these scattered pieces. It's still very disconnected for me, but I landed in academia, and the academic life is a lot more taking things apart than it is putting things together. So the academic training and just the privilege of having a position where it's kind of part of my job description to think about things like this. I'm grateful for that opportunity, but it doesn't heal everything, right? So there is still that process of trying to, from all these scattered pieces that I find that nourish me in different ways, to try to pull it together and try to assemble it into something coherent. My most recent work started, I did a lot of deconstruction, but with the hope that maybe it's a setup to putting it back together. And that's my work that you mentioned on the hadiths. So for my most recent research, I looked at the hadith corpus, and I was thinking, what can the prophetic body do? What are the possibilities for the prophetic body as laid out in the hadith? And I don't have a position that these are all authentic hadiths. I'm not going there in terms of, you know, whether this is the real Muhammad. I'm looking at what people said about him over a course of generations, and the way that his body becomes this conduit for barakah, that barakah flows through his body to other bodies that he connects with. And because access to bodies and interactions between bodies is always gendered, these circulations of barakah were gendered, which didn't mean they were non-negotiable. So for an example, there's hadiths where the Prophet says, you know, anyone whose hand I shake, I will be your intercessor. And someone who shakes his hand, and someone who shakes his hand, and someone who shakes his hand. But he's only shaking hands with men, right? So that, and they're only shaking hands with men. So there's a limit to this, how this barakah can circulate. But there's also women who are collecting his sweat in a bottle because they see it as an emanation of barakah, that there's barakah in this physical substance, and they engage it in the ways that they can engage it. I also see a difference in the ways that people talk about his body. So most of the hadiths that I encountered, not all, I mean, it's not absolute, but most of the hadiths that I encountered in which the Prophet's body is this transcendent barakah circulating force comes from men. And in contrast, over and over and over again, I see Aisha narrating a very mundane, very, yeah, he threw away this cloak because his sweat smelled bad. You know, like this very mundane, very typical human body. So that's something I kind of open a portal to also. And finally, because, you know, I don't want to take time away from the conversation. Going back to the divine feminine, when I was thinking about Muhammad's body in this hadith research, I also had to think about God's body, the way that God sometimes has a body in hadith materials and isn't simply this transcendent, abstracted intellect, but like actually walks around and appears in a very gendered form to the Prophet, like a very gendered representation to him. And in my personal experience, in terms of, you know, when I was engaging in ayahuasca ceremonies, that wasn't the divine that I encountered. So for me personally, there's this disconnect between what the hadith represent to me, the way that the hadith present Allah, and the forms in which the divine expressed, you know, that I found an expression of the divine, you know, in my own kind of internal chemical processes. So there's a lot of places the conversation can go. Again, I hope that was a setup. I'm grateful that we can have this conversation and reconnect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of things I really want to jump on, but I'm gonna try to rein myself in because actually there were certain specific things that I wanted to say, and so I'm gonna time myself so that I also do not go on too long. I had to check the dates with Wikipedia because my first encounter with Professor Knight was being in my office in Virginia at the university I first taught in the United States, and I received this self-published volume called Taqwa Course. Now, I have no experience with punk and don't particularly have a desire to have an experience more than, you know, just a little bit. But I actually was smitten by the capacity to be able to imagine these characters interacting. First of all, I was at a university teaching in the age range of the, you know, the main characters in this book. And of course they were doing, you know, collective living experiences. And yet I had not thought, you know, how might I imagine this for Muslims, you know, at that age and in this time, you know? And it was 100% convincible. Sometimes I would quibble. It's like, okay, well, if she's niqabi, then how, you know, but just that quibbling was an indication of just how real those characters were for me, although foreign in the ways in which, you know, as I said, I didn't have any experience with punk. And I was so sorry that I had not played the corporate academic game well enough that I had some way to be able to promote this. It was before social media. You know, my access to it. So I couldn't do anything. I couldn't give you like a bigger publisher or something like that. I couldn't do anything, you know, but I was very smitten by these characters, but you were still faceless, although there was a name. Fast forward to the fact that in certain places, tongue in cheek, I refer to Michael as my bodyguard. In 2005, when the invitation came for the leading of the Salat and the delivery of the khutbah for the Friday Jummah in New York, the organizers did a lot of things that I had nothing to do with, some of which I thought was good and some of which I thought was not so good. But one of the things was this function of, actually having gatekeepers. And I want to talk about that a little bit because in the context of the history and development of the Nation of Islam, and the Nation of Islam its origins is Black Americans. Principally, these were Black Americans who converted to Islam or returned to Islam, depending on how one sees their location. They were also very conscientious about the problems with white supremacy. If you study the Nation of Islam, it's such an amazing indictment on both Black life and Islam in America. The Nation of Islam was the first Black organization that actually promoted healthy eating, brown rice, not so much meat products, obviously no pork, even the way you prepare the foods, the famous bean pie. I mean, because they were so, out of the other forms of protein source from animals, they created the bean pie, which is to this day my favorite pie, But they also developed their paramilitary wing called the Fruit of Islam, FOI. And from outside, sometimes people look at this as sort of like randomly violent, but they had no need to participate at that level. Instead, what they understood is that communities need neighborhood watch or community watch. So fast forward, I moved to California after I retired early. And I remember visiting one of the, sort of developments of the Nation of Islam was the Waterdeep Mohammed community. And yet they still maintained certain aspects of what that experience had been, in the nation. And there was some act of violence against, innocent citizens somewhere in the United States, often called terrorist attack. And there was some act like that, and they knew that when these things happen, that there would be a fallout for Muslims and Muslim communities. So what they did is they actually, I was at a Jummah, and they actually asked for volunteers to come and just sort of walk the streets at certain times of day, just to check, when the kids are getting out of school, is it safe for them to go, back home? They just watched just to make sure that everybody was safe. And again, as you were saying earlier about benevolent patriarchy, we wouldn't need benevolent patriarchy if there were not things that attacked our persons, in our own homes, in our communities, or whatever. And so the idea that they did this as a way to protect the community was just so overwhelming for me, because again, it's just like a neighborhood watch that really started in white communities. It's just the way in which people take care of each other, and especially when there's like times of high risk, So I really liked the idea when I learned later that, you had been a bodyguard, but again, we hadn't met. I cannot remember when we met, but both of these events happened in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century. The thing that kind of followed from that, because I've read many of your books, not all of them. In fact, when I looked over the list on the Wikipedia page, I thought, oh, I didn't know he had a book like that. So there's a couple of things I still want to get into. But the thing about it is you tackle, okay, so I'm going to use your words and just sort of say how I see them. The idea that often we experience fragmentation in our lives. I think that we are very fragile beings. And there's lots of things that can set us off, lots of experiences that just, don't gel, and grappling with those sometimes is what builds character. And again, I'm not recommending trauma as a way to build character. I'm simply saying that when we do experience things that are traumatic, we have to reconcile them, and we have to reconcile them not only for our own lives personally, but we have to reconcile them with regard to our worldview. And that worldview includes, for many of us, the divine. And so one of the ways in which I have dealt with, sort of fragmentation is that each of the fragments are reflections of the Tawheed, the reality of the unity as an active term. And that bringing them all together is in fact what makes us us. And us coming to terms with ourselves, knowing ourselves, is a reflection of how we also are part of that tajalli, part of the expression of Allah, in time. And we having the need to reconcile those fragments is, again, I think, an act of Tawheed. So it's another dimension of the Tawheedic paradigm, because I've gone beyond just talking about it as social justice. I also talk about it as spiritual well-being, which includes a relationship between our sort of psychological experiences. But over time, one of the things that I think I found most fascinating about you is you know more about the Black community and the history of Black Islam than I do, and I'm Black. And that's why I say that you give me so much hope, because sometimes, for example, when we talk about feminisms, people think it has something to do with women being women. They don't think about it as a set of dynamics with regard to power structures and how gender is enacted, amongst the humans in their communities. And so Blackness, I think there's a little bit of this in Saud Abu Kabir's book, A Muslim Cool, in terms of the development of hip hop in the Muslim context. It's not just a Black form of artistic expression anymore. So it has become a unifying form of expression. And so the Black experience in America is uniquely experienced by the Black community, but it's not closed to analysis, consideration, and indeed integration. So you have managed to do that. So as I said, even to the extent that you know a whole lot more stuff than I know, you have managed to do that. But what I like best about it is that you take specific experiences and you reflect them back on the ways in which we construct our theology. So the last point that I wanted to make, as I said, I wanted to do 3 things, and I know me, I'm long-winded. I might just keep going just out of admiration. The last thing I wanted to kind of get into was the idea about, Muhammad's body, upon him be peace, and what I found when I was doing my research on sexual diversity and human dignity. This was a man who was surrounded by women. He had 2 mothers, because he had a nursing mother and he had a biological mother. He came into the world without a father, because his father died before he was born. Between the 2 mothers, he experienced 2 different forms of mothering, and yet by all reports, those seem to be pretty good. But also he was taken in a patriarchal society by first his grandfather and then his uncle. And this was the thing that I thought was very interesting, because both of them, when they took in the child, had entered into that daughter stage that older men get into when they themselves are more comfortable with their own feminine aspects. And there's so many interesting reports about the loving relationship, like, the grandfather, wouldn't go to sleep until he was sure that the kid was comfortable, and the kid would come and fall asleep, on his, just laying his head on his leg, and just very intimate, very feminine articulations, even of the main patriarchs who were his guardians. Of course, he marries first an older woman. And I also find that very interesting, because she had a certain level of worldly, I want to say, capacity, because of the businesses. Having hired him to be the outward front of businesses had to still be a male body. And in observing him, she felt more about his personality. But also, as we know, she was sort of like the midwife who nurtured his trauma of the encounter with the angel in the cave of Hira. When he came back to her, she used not only her relationship with him, that is, he could listen to her, but also, you know, she referred him to her cousin to get more knowledge about revelation. I mean, it was not just emotional; it was also logical. He only had daughters, and the relationship between him and his daughters, especially you find in Shia literature a lot of conversation about him in relationship to Fatima and the tenderness that he always demonstrated towards her. He had several wives. He also had concubines. And when Ibn Arabi talks about his, you know, love for perfume, women, and prayer, what if we collapse all of those into one kind of love? You know, and the idea often is expressed as if it's just sexual love for women, and ignoring this sort of background experience. But I also found it very interesting that he was known as El Amin, and one of the stories they like to tell is how the macho guys were all fighting over who was going to replace the Kaaba stone. And his method of reconciling that was to have the stone, you know, on a jacket or thobe or whatever, and each of the main tribes take a piece of it to lift to return it to its spot, and he just pushed it in. So again, this is kind of like a Tawhidic resolution. It is not hegemonic, it is not patriarchal. I also find that we dwell a lot on his return to Mecca without violence. We love to talk about that. But also, I began to get a sense that he was reluctant to engage in war at all, that it was not his temperament. And yet he was commanded by Allah. And sometimes I think maybe the emphasis of it in the Quran is not just because of those sort of hypocritical people who didn't want to take any risks, but also because it wasn't his method. And yet it was the method that the majority of the men and the leaders in that community would respect. And that was, you have to show that you will take up arms. So I feel sometimes that the Quran is saying, you know, it really is a good thing to participate in this smaller jihad as well as the bigger jihad, because sometimes you have to embody the justice that you want to see by challenging and standing up, being the bodyguard, the gatekeeper in your community against the kinds of things that could be an assault on that community. And you really have to stand up. So I came out with sort of an understanding of Muhammad as a feminine character. I never, this is the first time I ever said anything about it. I never said anything to anybody else. And since I'm at the end of my 15 minutes, I'm going to give you a chance to respond. And then I will look into the chat and I will open up to comments from the gallery. Thank you.
That was amazing. And I'm really happy that you're getting into the Hadith stuff, because when I was first floating the idea of a dissertation getting into Hadith studies, and gender was going to be a component of it, one of my committee members, you know, saying that, you know, Hadith work needed to be done, was saying, there's no amanu wadud for Hadith. You've made
Actually,
this.
there is. His name is Fakiullah here in Indonesia. He does an amazing thing with the Hadith, but go ahead. I don't want to.
And you know, I recognize Asma Saeed is doing things with isnads, and Ash Geisinger has done things with hadiths, and Scott Kugel's done things with hadiths. Sadia Sheikh has done things with hadiths, but the progressive Muslim tradition as it's developing has really been a Quran-centered tradition for a number of reasons that I'm sympathetic to. But you know, this mentor's remark that there needed to be more hadith things. I'm really looking forward to hadith conversations with you. But when you mentioned Khadija and the first revelation, I was reminded of my favorite version of that narrative, and it's not a quote unquote canonical narrative. And I'm not, you know, taking a position on hadith authenticity in general here, but my favorite version, my non-canonical favorite, has Khadijah in the cave when it happens. And this is very rare. You know, it's in Tayalisi's Musnad, but I think that's the only place where it can be found. But in this version, Khadijah's in the cave when it's happening, and I've been in that cave. It's a small, very tight space. So when I was in that cave, there were two aunties praying side by side, and I'm trying, because there's a long line, and I'm very conscientious about the line behind me. I'm trying to like get a prayer in, but like I can't fully stand. Like that's how, like there's two standing aunties here, and I'm kind of crouched over like this, trying to get my prayer you know, in and out. So it's a small, very cramped space. So to think of I think the way I describe it in writing is, you know, someone giving birth on an elevator. You know, they're in an elevator, and like their partner is there and the doctor's there, and it's this very cramped, very intimate space. So when I think of Khadijah, that's the version that I run to. So it's not a canonical hadith in the sense that it has a broken isnad. Like it's someone like says he heard it from a man, like just anonymous, unnamed person who said they heard it from Aisha. But Shahab Ahmed says that sometimes these bad isnads are actually the older versions, because it's later on that perfect isnads become like, you know, you need to have a flawless, well-evidenced isnad to demonstrate your authenticity. So if you have a bad isnad, it kind of precedes hadith science, is the argument. Like it's an older version, but so I like that opening that you just made. I think we first met at the AAR. I think so. We have pictures where I have name tags. I'm wearing a name tag. So I know there was a year that the AAR was in California, and Sadaf and I visited you outside the AAR, but we also met at the AAR. So that might have been the first time. Yeah.
I'm okay with the mystery. Because I was impressed by you before I met you. So, you know, when I get to see you you didn't unimpress me like, oh my God, he's really an asshole, you know. So I'm okay to stick with I don't exactly remember the first encounter. I hope it wasn't AAR, but that's okay. That's just because it's so far in my history right now. Actually, I was curious about your thoughts on the reflection of your own fragmented experience as a kind of tawheed. That in fact it's that reconciliation of the different parts that really helps us to come to a level of presence with Allah and Allah's presence with us. How do you feel about that?
Well, I love the aspect that you mentioned of thinking about our traumas as unveilings, that these are all tajallis, that these are all expressions. I get into the Wahda al-Wujud a lot. Like that's kind of something that personally resonates with me. And as a Muslim engaging, you know, the 5%, that was a way of me, you know, there was a time in my life where I was going to the Nimatullahi Sufi order downtown, and then going to the 5% as a law school uptown. And it was all kind of swirling together for me, partly through the Wujudi ethic. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I should think more in those terms of trauma as an unveiling, as an opening, you know, as an expression of, you know, divine names. Even if, you know, the trauma is the disproportionate nature of the unveiling, that you're seeing a lot of power, you're not seeing the generosity, you're not seeing the mercy at a particular moment. Yeah, I mean, I am always trying to pull it together into something coherent. And I think my struggle right now is I see the coherence as something that's coming from outside. You know, that's kind of the transcendence. Like I'm here on this plane and taking a kind of comfort in the incoherence and the fragmentation of my religious artifacts, you know, for the time being, because what defined my initial experience of Islam was this extraordinary resistance to fragmentation, that I needed to preserve this monolithic coherence at all cost. And that closed me off from productive encounters. And so now, you know, I'm kind of promiscuously open to different expressions of Islam in a way that I'm okay with. And there could be a unity underneath that, or there can be unity above it or down the road from it. But right now, that intellectual and spiritual promiscuity is something that I take comfort in.
Well, as above, so below. I think on a daily basis, I have to kind of renew this connection between the inner and the outer, because I can imagine, as far as having a creative imagination and a sort of over busy cerebral context, I can imagine all kinds of things, and yet sometimes I'm not experiencing them. And so what I'm trying to do is to, remind myself, regularly that there is actually a conversation between those two things, that apparently you cannot imagine it if you have not had, my sheikh always likes to say, zikr is remembrance. You can't remember if you haven't had an experience with it before. And I kind of like that, even though at the moment it's still pretty cerebral. I haven't been able to deeply internalize it sufficiently, but it gives me something to work on. We have no comments in the chat. I don't know if it's because you guys were so fascinated that you couldn't think of anything, but we will be moving forward as we've been at this for more than a half an hour. If you have comments, can you sort of raise your hand? If you don't know where the raise your hand function is, in the chat, if you hit on wherever on your computer is the thing that says chat, there is usually a thing that also says raise your hand. Actually, I don't see it on mine. Okay, so we have some questions. I'm going to start with them in the order that they came up, and you can just, I'm going to unmute you, I think. From Whitner Martin, you have a question? Let me see, let me go to the participant page and find you so I can unmute you. Unmute. All right, you have the floor.
Okay. Good evening. Can you all hear me? Is this
Yes.
working? That's nice. This is actually a great moment for me, because this is the first time I have actually the opportunity to participate live in something, like not in a Sufi transnational way. It's 3 a.m. in the morning, so I wrote down my message, and I'm trying to read it out in good English, but I'm very tired. So Salama, good evening. First, I want to thank you, Saida Amina Wadud, for this opportunity. This is the closest I might get to participating in a lecture by Professor Knight, whose literature I adore and inhale, as we say in Germany. As a devoted reader and self-proclaiming groupie number one, I want to thank you on the most personal level possible. Your books were the guidance I was looking for and never let me down. I remember a tweet where I think you was thinking about the effects of your work, and I'm happy to say that I managed to found a network, actually the first in our big company, to celebrate cultural diversity and fight racist structures. Your books and the knowledge that they gave me will hopefully be the basis for a productive future for many others here. My question is, Professor Nye, what do you personally wish for the coming development of Islamic studies concerning literature, academic working processes, etc.? Because to me, it often feels like it still seems to be an old boys network where the focus is more on fame and using knowledge to capitalize it than on spreading awareness for Muslim history and identity.
Well, thank you. I'm floored by your kindness to me, and I appreciate that. And I'm grateful if my stuff was useful at all. In terms of where I want to see Islamic studies going, in the United States, there's an intensifying split between different networks, and I'm in the good network, so I want to see that network do well. Basically, it's a question of theoretical engagements versus pure philology. There's definitely a gender dynamic to how these networks split, in terms of Muslim commitments and seeing gender studies as a useful framework for approaching the material. So I'm in the better network. If I'm networked, I mean, I kind of alienate everybody at some point, but I'm increasingly comfortable with where Islamic studies is going by the strength of the network with which I identify, with the aspects of the field with which I identify, their confidence and their mutual support for each other is really extraordinary. So I'm optimistic, actually, at least in the United States context, about where Islamic studies is going, because I see the right people doing lots of cool things. That's my short answer. So, but I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Paige, you can, let me just find you so I can unmute you. I can't find you. Maybe she left. Maybe because I didn't do her question first. I don't know. Okay. No other question from the peanut gallery? Sorry, I mean the gallery. Okay. So Cal, Owen, you have a question, please?
Yes, I do. I'm really interested in this phrase you had, Micheal, about the progressive Muslim tradition as it's developing. I think that as a convert, there's a real strong push for me to feel like I'm part of something authentic, and a really strong temptation to buy into the more authoritarian streams that constantly tell you that they're authentic. And so I'm interested from both of you, how you navigate that and find the community. I know for me, I've found it all online, and I guess for the moment, my spiritual home is Masjid Arabia in their digital network. But yeah, I feel like that's a real important personal struggle, like to feel like I'm authentic, but yet all of the connections I keep, I would assume somewhere fall in this developing progressive Muslim community. And I'm not terribly interested in making deep connections to a more authoritarian tradition.
Professor?
Oh, I mean, you can go first by all means.
No, I forget. This is you on the you're on my series as a friend, but
Okay.
the focus is supposed to be on you.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's a great question, and I struggle with the authenticity issue. My approach tends to lean on the academic training, which undermines claims of authenticity in general, and look at how our present definitions of authenticity are very historically specific, right? So we might have this idea of, is this Quran and Sunnah across time and space, and nothing has ever changed, and there's this timeless, unchanging tradition against which our stuff is just this flimsy, made-up, recent, modern thing. The more, and I think this goes back to Dr. Wadood's remark about fragmentation as expressions of the divine and tajalli. There are so many different multiplicities of Islamic expression historically, so many things that we take for granted now as timeless and unchanging from day one of the prophet are in fact modern and very historically contextually specific. So I lean on that whenever someone tries to say, well, whenever someone asks me, what does Islam say about sexuality, for example, we can challenge the question, right? Because the question is such a zoomed out airplane window kind of a question. Well, which Islam are you talking about? Which century, which geographic location, which school, which particular thinker? That does open me to problems that I struggle with still, and that, like, I am celebrating an incoherence, like the multiplicity that is my support also denies me the chance to make my own prescriptive claims. So this is why academics tend to make bad talking heads on talk shows or whatever, because someone wants the immediate, what does Islam say about this particular issue? And you're supposed to represent true Islam, and your training really undermines that claim, right? Because you have all these different conversations historically in different changing contexts in your head. So it becomes impossible for you to give that easy prescription. So in short, my answer is to look at the sheer diversity, the sheer multiplicity of the tradition, look at the full range of resources that we have, and see just how modern this claim of timelessness really is. And then, the response to that sometimes might be that you treat Islam like a buffet. And I'm personally okay with treating Islam like a buffet. I don't see that as a problem. What I see is we have this extraordinarily rich, deep, diverse tradition, and that gives us a lot of choices, and it's okay that we have choices. Choices isn't the problem. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, I think also in addition to the historical reality of such vast complexity and diversity, from which notions about the true Islam have been developed and falsely taken over. I think also I kind of lean towards the prophetic hadith, istafta qalbik, to take fatwa from your heart. And I want to say something about it because I think sometimes people think that means that, it's just like a touchy-feely thing. But because I was raised, in the home of a Methodist minister who maintained the integrity of his faith, you live in the house, so you know what's going on. And as such, he set a really high bar with regard to, honesty and integrity in the faith journey. I would like to think that istafta qalbik, take some understanding or opinion from your heart, is more like it's okay to use yourself, your subjective reality, as a rubric of analysis. However, I link that with Khalid Abu Fadl's thing about the conscientious pause. So his thing was, if you find something that you're not comfortable with, even if they say it's authentic, it's your duty to take a pause. And in that pause, you should investigate further. And the investigation will inevitably lead you to these diversities of opinions and reflections across time and geography. But also, you give yourself permission to be the one that has the experience with Allah, with Islam, and with the future of those two things. And I think sometimes we don't verify that. And I found in working with gender for so many years that one of the first steps for women to reclaim any type of authority in Islam is for them to also reclaim their own experience. So I would advise that. Okay, so we have Mohammed, Mia, and you're welcome, Cal, Owen, for your thank you there. But Mohammed, you have the floor.
Assalamu alaikum. First, I want to say thank you. I read Dr. Amina Wadood. I read your work this semester. I'm a grad student at Union Seminary and read your work in our Women, Islam and Interpretation class and really loved it. So very grateful to be here. I know that both of you are doing incredible work with non-binary readings of the Quran, but also querying and bringing up what are the pauses, what are the silences, what are the questions and ambiguities in how we can read, and like what possibilities. And I wanted to ask if you could speak more about your work in those areas and those modes of reading.
Am I going first again, or?
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of, if I understand the question properly, where I'm going with the Quran, like what I'm doing these days?
Yeah, so I think there's the one chapter, or there were two chapters where you talked about the queer art of failure in relationship to failed deeds and how those functions and what possibilities open up from there. But then also queerness is not merely referring to sexual orientation, but the ways in which gender and sexuality are used to marginalize communities. And you also, I think you made that one connection in Tripping with Allah, where you talk about trying, or like the queering of Osama bin Laden's body as a type of like terror and monstrosity. I think those were some things that I was like really interested in your writing.
Thank you. So to reference tripping with Allah. So for those who don't know, I mean, this was my ayahuasca narrative. And after a few failed attempts, I do get my vision that I was looking for with ayahuasca. And it's an experience of Fatima Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet. And when I asked Fatima about the Quran, she says, "That's for the boys, leave it alone." And so that was what I walked away from the ayahuasca vision with. And you know, my research moved towards hadith, which is even more for the boys than the Quran is. But I was struck in that vision. It distanced me somewhat, or made a disconnect for me with much progressive Muslim thought that I think seeks to recalibrate the meaning, you know, recalibrate what the Quran really means. And I can't, like at this point, I can't do it. Like I don't feel I have the tools to do it. I don't have, like kind of recently, having finished my academic training, like I'm probably the lowest in confidence that I've ever been in terms of reconstructing meaning, because you walk out of, you know, the academy like, oh, nothing is anything, and who am I? And it's all my subjective, you know. So I'm trying to, you know, if I build that up again, I can do some constructive theological work with it. But I've been interested in a life after interpretation, you know, because I didn't let go of the Quran because Fatima said it was for the boys. But I was thinking about ways in which, you know, after I have the ayahuasca vision, I go to the masjid and I do a very typical salat, and I'm reciting Quran, and my brain is still kind of fuzzy from that experience, and the words don't have meaning at this point. You know? It's not discourse. The Quran isn't a dissertation that I'm reading. It's this, you know, be kind of careless with my terms. It's like a shamanic experience that is on paper, you know. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about what the Quran does rather than what it means or what it says or what it is or what it claims to be, right? Because I experience the Quran in a particular way. Like the Quran is a technology of affects around me. You know, when I hear it, when I hold it in my hands, when I smell it in a particular context, right? There's smells that we might associate with the Quran. I mean, just like my particular, you know, experience of chai and styrofoam cups reminds me of the Quran, you know, because like I became Muslim and it's during Ramadan, I'm going to Taraweeh prayers and I'm hearing the Quran for a long time and having chai and styrofoam cups. Like I have all these connections to the sensory experience of the Quran that's not discursive, you know. So I think that's where I'm going with the Quran is what if the Quran's discourse is not on my side? You know, do I lose it? Do I lose the Quran? Are there alternative routes? Are there other pathways through from the Quran that I can experience? So I guess my short answer is I'm kind of tabling interpretation and thinking more about the body and the senses, and really trusting in my experience of it, rather than, you know, having my hands there and trying to, like, you know, look at the root and what everything is really saying. That's where I'm at right now is the body.
I don't have a lot to add to that, except that I am in the unique position, which I hope will remain forever till I die, of never having the bubble burst for me with regard to the Quran. I think the closest that I came to it was when I was challenged, someone saying that, you know, you're not able to say no to the text. And I had to think what that means. And of course, I thought through that using the most persnickety verse that I find in there, which is the one that commands to beat them. It brought me back to a dynamic kind of embodied sense of interpretation, which is on the basis of lived realities. And there's a lot that can be said about that, which I won't do here. But in terms of working, you know, in the queer Muslim context, I find that queer Muslims are often the ones who, like women, when I was just doing a straight kind of binary interpretation of gender, they're the ones whose bodies are on the line. And just as in my khutbah recently, I talked about the significance of embodied experience as a marker for how a law is active in our lives, and therefore how we perceive of the divine and what that means in terms of community. So in a lot of ways, I'm very hopeful for the future further development of queer theology in Islam. I'm also taking part to actively promote that in certain ways. Keep me in your prayers. I have a specific plan, as a matter of fact. But I think because it is still so limited in terms of its interpretive or academic articulation and the consolidation of those elements, we still haven't found sufficient ways to have it be integrated in our perception of Islam as a field of study for modernity. So that's what I'm hopeful for. I'm hopeful that we will really bring pieces together, because the other lovely thing is that queer Muslims who are lay persons, they're not academics and whatever, they're not waiting. They're just not waiting. And as such, they began to create the next conversation, the next iteration. And so I'm very excited about that. So hopefully in the future, next time we have this kind of meeting, there'll be more solid answers, and then we can deconstruct those. There is one more comment from Whitner Martin. Please, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. It kind of struck me when you were talking about the deconstruction thing, because here in Germany, in the universities, we learn that kind of Islamic studies in America is the role model now, like how it has to be. And when I talked to people from Pakistan or from Egypt, they told me that they have some sort of different academic tradition. I didn't know this till then. And in the process, I started asking myself, why do I have to learn this deconstruction method? And started deconstructing this academic deconstruction, which in the end led me to find out for myself that I don't want to stay in the academic field. Like after 10 years of studying Islamic studies, this is like not the best idea, but at least I got a job. So I'd like to know what you, Professor Knight, think about this deconstruction as an academic method and as the status quo in Islamic studies. If you know what
well, I don't think it is the status quo in Islamic studies in the US. So when I referred earlier to competing networks, this is kind of a flashpoint. So historically, Islamic studies was very Near Eastern languages and cultures program oriented. You spend your 8 years or whatever it is learning a language and do your translation work, and that's you're a scholar. There's this widening rift in North American Islamic studies between these very philologically oriented scholars and more theoretically grounded scholars, or an effort to bring in things like ethnography as Islamic studies, to do anthropology as Islamic studies, and that Islamic studies isn't simply this classical Orientalist method of what do the texts say, right? So there are scholars who excel in both camps or are accepted in both camps, but there's people who are firmly on one side or the other. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say Islamic studies is just deconstructive theory. Like I experienced some of that. Like I know why someone would say it, and there's Islamic studies people in the United States who themselves would say that resentfully because they feel like theory has taken over. But that's still a very tense and controversial question, in North American academia about which direction Islamic studies can go, because the stereotype is you have these theoretical people who are obsessed with gender analysis, with race analysis, with queer studies, and they don't have the language chops to do quote unquote real Islamic studies. And it's not a justified stereotype, but you know, on the other side, there's the stereotype that these people who really have their language chops down are all kind of doing Salafi type projects, you know, or pushing out things like gender analysis. So it's still a messy field over here. So.
Thank you.
I think one of the reasons why I retired early from US academia was that I did not see that the programs of study were interested in what I call the production of new knowledge in Islam. And I considered that Islamic feminism is one such aspect of new knowledge. And yet, again, I am like Micheal, hopeful that enough of it is being generated, a critical mass is such that it's going to become undeniable. And if you're not keeping pace, you simply are falling behind. And there's a lot of people who are still falling behind because they're entrenched in their comfort zones that have been created by rubrics of analysis that worked at other points in the academy. So the academy itself needs to challenge itself, I think, in order to be able to keep pace. We are close to the end of our time. I'm actually very happy about it, but sometimes these things can run a really long time. And I'm going to close with something that is a mystery to me, so you might have to kind of clarify for me. I watch your posts with regard to, you know, WWF, and before I met you, one of the things that I saw, or before I remember meeting you, one of the things that I saw was this thing about Ibrahim Hopper, and you're going to battle with these heads. I loved it. Again, I don't know anything about wrestling. The only thing I know about wrestling, I think I know from you. Can you please tell me what exactly is your history with it? Because I don't know.
My history with wrestling in general, or my history with Ibrahim Hooper?
With wrestling in general. Ibrahim Hooper is not so significant. I got that story. I kind of want to know. I have a suspicion that you were actually a wrestler, but it's only a suspicion.
I've dabbled. So I converted, you know, to Islam when I was young, really, really young. I found Malcolm at 14 or 15. Before that, I was, you know, my gateway to Malcolm was Public Enemy. So I was 13 around when I found Public Enemy. So when I struggle with questions of identity and who am I, what constitutes this, other than Islam, I don't have a lot, because it was so early in my life that became everything. So wrestling is kind of a way for me to tether myself to like a longer continuity, because prior to age 13, that was everything I was obsessed with. I really can only think of like one thing at a time, you know, like it's, so it was wrestling, and then it was Malcolm, you know. So I have this sense of continuity in my life that, you know, and also as I've progressed into academia, you know, wrestling is kind of like the antithesis to, in terms of class coding and all of that. So it's also kind of a way of like, okay, I actually come from here, you know, this surrounding that I'm in right now of, you know, university, institution environment. I actually come from somewhere else. I come from, you know, Saturday morning wrestling. So that's kind of the meaning that it has. And then what it does for me today is, it's just a way of embodied mythology. You know, I find my feelings projected onto these imaginary conflicts. And if I can say one thing, okay, well, actually another thing, two things. So number one, I've dabbled in wrestling. I don't know if it's visible, but there's a big kind of thing here. So that comes from this guy right here, Abdullah the Butcher. So in 2009, I was invited to a book festival, and they said, do something besides a reading because readings are boring. I said, well, Abdullah the Butcher was in Atlanta, and I've had childhood nightmares with him, you know, my whole life. So how about I wrestle Abdullah the Butcher? And that's how I got that. So it's 46 stitches. He's the butcher, so that's what he does. Yeah, and so the other thing I was going to say is WWE is owned by Trump supporters. I love wrestling unconditionally and without judgment, but WWE is garbage. And so I'm into like 1990s women's Japanese wrestling right now. That's my like completely innocent of like I just can't watch the Trump show right now. So 1990s Japanese women's wrestling, it's artistically better. They're better at their craft. It's a better product, and it doesn't go to Trump. So that's my wrestling spiel.
And I think it's a wonderful place for me to express my gratitude to you for always keeping it real and for changing when it is necessary in order to achieve the higher good. So you can keep your love of wrestling, but you don't have to, follow the current resident of the White House in any way, shape, or form. So it's already another sign of admiration. Also want to thank the people in the gallery. Again, we will post this on the page at first, and after a week, I will make it public. Michael, I'll send you a link as soon as I do the recording bit that has to happen over here. It has to run its thing, and then I get it, and then I can post it on my YouTube as unlisted, and then I will send you a link. So you will have a copy of it sooner than it's made public, and you can do with it as you like. You're wonderful. Thank you so much. I love you. Salam alaikum, salam to the family.
Alaikum salam. And thank you everyone for taking part. Thank you so much.
Alhamdulillah.